tonight, we tell perhaps the most terrifying what-if in all of Tolkien's legendarium. Not what if Sauron won, not what if Frodo failed, but something far more unsettling. What if Gandalf took the One Ring? At first, the answer seems simple. He would defeat Sauron. He would save Middle-earth. He would bring peace. But Tolkien understood something deeply frightening. The greatest evil is not always born from hatred. Sometimes it is born from love, from wisdom, from the sincere desire to do good. For Gandalf would not become a Dark Lord of fire and shadow. No, he would become something far more dangerous, a righteous ruler, a benevolent tyrant. A king who truly believed he alone knew what was best for all peoples, and under such power, even goodness can become tyranny. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy deep journeys into Tolkien lore. And tell me in the comments, if you stood in Frodo's place, would you trust Gandalf with the ring? Now dim the lights, set aside the noise of the world, and let us walk together into a darker road. One that was never taken. A road where the Grey Pilgrim reached out his hand, and this time accepted the ring. In the quiet years of the Third Age, when the Shires still lay green and untroubled beneath gentle skies, there came upon Middle-earth a doom long hidden and scarcely understood. For the ruling ring, forged in the fires of Orodruin by Sauron the Deceiver, had returned at last into the hands of the free peoples. Long it had wandered, long it had remained lost beneath darkness, greed, and chance. Yet, chance, as the wise knew, was seldom chance alone. And so it came into the keeping of Frodo Baggins of the Shire. Small was he among the great powers of the world. No king, no warrior, no lure master. And perhaps for that very reason, the burden fell to him. For there are strange workings in the designs of fate, wherein the small are chosen to their weights, the mighty dare not touch. When the Grey came unto Bag End and revealed the truth of Bilbo's ring, a shadow passed between them. Not the shadow of fear alone, but recognition. For Gandalf knew, he knew what lay upon the table between them. He knew the weight of that small golden circle, and he feared it. Not because he doubted its power, because he understood it too well. Long he had resisted even touching it. Long had he kept his hands from possession. For he knew the ring did not merely tempt through greed. It tempted through virtue. It whispered not only to the cruel, it whispered to the merciful, to the wise, to the just. Most dangerously of all, to those who wished to heal the world. For evil often comes cloaked in malice, but the deepest corruption comes cloaked in righteousness. Then spoke words that would alter the fate of Arda, words simple and innocent, yet heavy with terrible possibility. He said that he wished to give the ring to Gandalf, to place the burden into hands wiser and stronger than his own. And in the true tale, Gandalf refused, swiftly, fearfully, knowing what acceptance would mean. But let us now turn from the road that was and tread instead the darker road that might have been. For in this telling, Gandalf did not refuse. Far away, beyond mountain and river, beyond forest and ruined kingdom, in the black land of Mordor, a will of ancient malice stirred. Felt it, not clearly, not fully, but enough. A presence, a disturbance, a new claimant. For the One Ring was no mere weapon. It was bound to its maker. A vessel of Sauron's native power, carrying within it his cruelty, pride, and desire for dominion. And now, for the first time in long centuries, it rested in the hand of one mighty enough to challenge him. In Bag End, the silence deepened. Felt it first, a pressure in the air, as though the room had become small, as though unseen walls had moved inward, stood motionless. The ring lay in his palm, small, golden, deceptively simple, yet its weight seemed greater with every passing heartbeat. He felt its call, not as words, as revelation. Knowledge surged at the edge of thought, possibilities, strategies, paths to victory. He saw armies gathering under a single banner. He saw the White City unbroken. He saw Mordor shattered. He saw the Nazgul fleeing before holy fire. He saw peace, order, an end to war. And within those visions lay the poison. The ring did not tempt by promising chaos. It tempted by promising solutions. It showed Gandalf everything he had long desired. An end to suffering, an end to shadow, an end to fear. What price would be too great for such things? That was the question. That was always the question. Frodo looked upon him with trust unguarded, the trust of one who could not yet comprehend what had begun. And Gandalf, still clutching the ring, turned slowly toward the hobbit. Something in his face had changed, not corrupted, not monstrous. No darkness clouded his features. That would have been easier to resist. No, he appeared radiant. Terribly radiant. His eyes burned with terrible clarity. The burden of uncertainty seemed gone. For Gandalf had chosen. Doubt had left him. And certainty can be more dangerous than malice. He spoke then, and his voice seemed deeper than before, not louder, deeper, as though old power stirred beneath mortal form. He declared that the burden was ended, that Frodo need not fear any longer, that the ring would trouble him no more. And Frodo, though relieved, felt an unease he could not explain. Some instinct, quiet but persistent, warned him this was wrong, not evil, something stranger, something colder. For Gandalf no longer wrestled with possibility. He had accepted necessity. That is how tyranny often begins, not with cruelty, with conviction. He began speaking of what must now be done, not what might be done, what must be done. The distinction mattered. There would be no council, no debate in Rivendell, no uncertain wandering toward impossible hope. There would be war, swift, decisive, necessary. The ring had already begun reshaping his mind, not by twisting his desires into opposites, by magnifying what already lived within him. His pity became duty, his wisdom became judgment, his care became control. For the ring works best not by replacing virtue, but by weaponizing it. Thus the Grey Pilgrim began to change, not in form, not yet, but in spirit. His thoughts moved with frightening speed. Plans formed instantly. Allies became assets. Kingdoms became pieces upon a board. He now saw Middle-earth not as scattered peoples with free will, but as a realm requiring order, unity, direction, his direction. That night, Gandalf did not sleep, nor did Sauron. Across the vast distance between Shire and Mordor, two ancient powers had become aware of one another. Not fully, but enough. Sauron understood something terrible. A rival had arisen. Not a king of men, not an elf lord. Something older, a Maya, one of his own Or. And unlike mortals, such a rival could truly wield the ring. For the first time in long ages, Sauron felt fear. Not fear of destruction, fear of replacement. For he knew the cruelest truth of all. Should Gandalf master the ring, the Dark Lord would fall. But evil would not end. It would merely wear white instead of black. Word spread swiftly among the wise, too swiftly. Gandalf no longer moved as he once had. Gone was the wandering uncertainty of the Grey Pilgrim. Gone was the patience that listened before acting. He now moved with purpose, sharpened into command. Every step carried decision. Every word carried authority. When he came to Rivendell, those gathered there sensed the change at once. Elrond perceived it first. Ancient though he was, and wise beyond most living in Middle-earth, even he struggled to name what troubled him. The power emanating from Gandalf did not feel corrupted. That was the most unsettling part. No stench of darkness, no shadow, no malice. Instead, there came a terrible sense of overwhelming order. Clarity so absolute it left no room for doubt. And where doubt dies entirely, freedom soon follows. Aragorn bowed his head when Gandalf entered, not merely out of respect. Something deeper compelled obedience. Legolas felt his heart tighten. Gimli's hands unconsciously clenched around the haft of his axe. Boromir, however, felt something else. Hope. At last, he thought, a power great enough to oppose Mordor. A leader worthy of absolute trust, and therein lay the danger. For Gandalf inspired not fear, but willing surrender. At the council, voices rose as they had in the true tale. Debate, uncertainty. Questions of war, secrecy, and burden. Yet all of it ended the moment Gandalf spoke. Silence followed his words as wind follows thunder. He declared that the ring would not be destroyed. A murmur swept the chamber. Elrond rose immediately. The air between them grew heavy. For perhaps the first time in centuries, two of the wise stood opposed. Elrond spoke of corruption, of domination, of the inevitable fall of all who wielded the ring. He spoke truth, but Gandalf now saw truth differently. He no longer denied the danger. He simply judged it necessary. That word had become his shield. Necessary for victory, necessary for peace, necessary for survival. Saruman had once spoken similarly. That irony did not escape Elrond. He saw with growing horror what had begun. Not the fall of a wizard into darkness, but the rise of something more subtle. A power convinced of its own righteousness. Aragorn spoke next, carefully, respectfully. Yet even he questioned whether any being should hold such power. Gandalf turned his gaze upon him, and for a moment, Aragorn felt as though every secret fear within him had been laid bare. His doubt, his hesitation, his uncertainty about kingship. All seen, all judged. Gandalf spoke not with anger, but certainty. He declared that the age of hesitation had ended. The free peoples had delayed too long. Compassion had become weakness. Mercy had become vulnerability. Now, not tomorrow, not after endless counsel. Now. It was then the fellowship truly broke. Not by battle, by belief. Boromir pledged himself first, without hesitation. To him, Gandalf had become the answer Gondor had prayed for. A savior, a shield, a force that could finally end the terror of Mordor. Others remained silent. Legolas felt unease deepen into dread. Gimli sensed pride hidden beneath wisdom. Aragorn felt grief. Frodo felt fear. Only Sam, simple and stubborn, understood something essential. Not through wisdom, through love. He looked at Gandalf and knew this was no longer the same friend who sat by Bagin's fire. The voice remained, the face remained. But something had shifted beyond words. The fellowship never formed as it once had. No company of 9 that parted in fragile hope. No humble journey through wild lands began. That road had vanished. Instead, lines were drawn. Believed power could save Middle-earth, and those who believed power would consume it. Elrond refused allegiance. Galadriel refused submission. Both understood the terrible truth. If Gandalf mastered the ring fully, even Sauron's defeat would not restore freedom. Middle-earth would survive, but under one absolute will. And so the wise divided, not into darkness and light, into competing visions of salvation. This made the conflict infinitely more tragic, for Gandalf still desired good. He still loved Middle-earth. He still sought peace, yet the ring had begun its perfect work. Not corruption through evil, corruption through certainty. That was its greatest weapon, the belief that one alone knows what must be done. Far away in Barad-dûr, Sauron watched, and he understood with terrible clarity what others had not yet accepted. A new ring lord had arisen, not a servant, not a thief, a rival. War was no longer inevitable. It had already begun. But this war would not be between darkness and light. It would be between two powers, both seeking dominion, one through terror, the other through order. And Middle-earth stood between them. From that day forth, Gandalf the Grey was gray no longer. Though he still wore robes of pale ash and white, something greater had begun to shine through the frail guise of age. The disguise itself had started to fail. For the flesh of old men had never been his true nature. He was Olorin, a Maya of the West, a spirit of ancient fire and wisdom. Long had he clothed that power in humility. Long had he diminished himself for the sake of those he guided. But now the ring called that buried power outward. And power, once invited, seldom remains contained. Those who traveled beside him soon noticed the change. His presence filled every chamber. His words no longer invited reflection. They compelled agreement. Even silence around him felt altered, heavy, charged. To stand near him became both comforting and unsettling. For his will now pressed outward constantly, not violently, as light fills darkness, as fire radiates heat. His thoughts increasingly turned toward action. Armies, fortresses, supply routes, all the scattered strengths of the free peoples now appeared to him as unfinished pieces of a single design. The elves of Lindon, the riders of Rohan, the men of Gondor, the dwarves of Erebor, even the hidden strength of the Dunedain. Separate, they were vulnerable. United beneath one will, they could become unstoppable. His will. That final thought no longer troubled him. At first, he told himself he sought stewardship, not rulership, guidance, not dominion. But such distinctions began to blur. The ring excelled at blurring moral boundaries. It did not rush corruption. It refined justification. Day by day, Gandalf's internal resistance weakened. Not because he embraced evil, because he increasingly believed opposition itself endangered the world. Dissent became inefficiency. Independence became instability. Freedom became risk. These were subtle changes, yet history often turns upon subtle shifts long before catastrophe becomes visible. Galadriel perceived this most clearly. From Lothlorien, she felt the rising power like a fire spreading across unseen roots. When Gandalf came before her, there passed between them no sword, no spell, no open hostility, only understanding. Two mighty spirits measuring one another. Galadriel beheld what he was becoming, a lord of light, terrible and beautiful. Not unlike the vision she herself had once rejected. Had she taken the ring, she too might have become such a queen. Now that possibility stood before her in another form. Gandalf asked for alliance, not as plea, as expectation. Galadriel refused. Not because she doubted his love for Middle-earth, because she trusted it too little. Love, armed with absolute power, becomes perilous. The more sincere the love, the more ruthless its justification. Gandalf departed without anger. Yet sorrow touched him, for he now saw resistance not as disagreement, but as tragic blindness. That made refusal easier to override. This was the most terrible transformation of all. Compassion remained, but it no longer restrained authority. It empowered it. Thus the new power rose, slowly, inevitably. Across Middle-earth, hearts began turning toward him, some willingly, some reluctantly. Many saw salvation. Boromir became one of his strongest champions. He returned to Gondor, speaking of Gandalf not as wizard, but as deliverer. Denethor resisted. Proud and sharp-minded, he sensed danger beneath promise. Yet, even Denethor felt something he hated to admit: hope. The White Wizard offered what Gondor had lacked for generations: certainty. No more desperate defense. No more slow decay. Victory. Total victory. And men hunger for certainty in dark times. Even Rohan began began to bend. Theoden, wearied by years of manipulation and decline, found renewed strength under Gandalf's presence. But where once Gandalf restored kings to themselves, now he restored them toward alignment with his design. The distinction was subtle, but profound. Far to the east, Sauron prepared. The Dark Lord now abandoned patience. The ring had escaped his reach permanently. That much he understood. But he also understood his rival. A Maya with the ring would not hide forever. Soon, power would seek power. Soon, one would destroy the other. Thus, Sauron gathered all. Orcs from Mordor, Easterlings from Rhûn, Haradrim from the south, trolls, wargs, siege engines, fire, steel. The greatest war since the last alliance approached. And Gandalf knew it. At last he stood alone beneath a white sky, the ring upon his hand. For the first time, he did not hide it. Flame shimmered around the golden band. Its light no longer seemed golden. It burned white, pure, blinding, beautiful, terrible. Then Gandalf raised his hand, and the air itself trembled. The winds shifted, clouds broke, light poured across the land like judgment. Those who witnessed it fell to their knees, some in devotion, some in fear, for the Grey Pilgrim had vanished. In his place stood something vast, a lord of fire and will, radiant as the sun through storm, and all understood. A new power had arisen in Middle-earth, not dark, not yet, but absolute. The white fire had become a throne, and all roads now led toward war. War came at last, not as rumor, not as distant fear, but as iron, as flame, as marching feet that shook the earth. From Mordor poured the armies of Sauron. Orcs blackened the plains like spreading rot. Trolls advanced beneath towers of iron. Standards bearing the lidless eye rose beneath smoke-dark skies. The east emptied its strength into war. The south answered with fire and steel. Never since the elder days had such power gathered under a single dark command. Yet for the first time in ages, the free peoples did not meet that darkness with fear. They met it with certainty. For Gandalf had united them. The banners of Gondor flew beside those of Rohan. Elves marched from Lindon and Rivendell. Even dwarves of Erebor came armored in steel and grim resolve. Ancient divisions had vanished. Not healed, overruled. That distinction mattered. Unity had come. But not through mutual trust. Through a greater will. Gandalf's will. He no longer traveled as a wanderer. No longer a counselor, whispering wisdom into the ears of kings. He stood openly at the center of power. Kings now sought his approval. Captains awaited his command. Councils existed, but their conclusions increasingly reflected what Gandalf had already decided. Few resisted. Those who did found resistance strangely difficult. Not because they were threatened, because standing against him felt like standing against necessity itself. This was the ring's deepest corruption. It transformed authority into inevitability, and inevitability is hard to oppose. Before the great march eastward, Aragorn came before Gandalf. The heir of Isildur had long watched the transformation with growing sorrow. He had hoped, for far too long, he had hoped that somewhere within this rising power remained the old Gandalf. The pilgrim, the friend, the guide who strengthened others rather than ruling them. But that hope had faded. Aragorn saw now what few dared speak. Middle-earth might survive this war and lose itself all the same. He knelt, not in submission, in grief, for he knew what must be said. He spoke of freedom, of kingship freely chosen, of men needing the right to fail, choose, and grow. A world without freedom, he argued, could not truly be saved. Gandalf listened, silent, still, radiant. Then he answered, and what he said chilled Aragorn more than anger would have. Gandalf agreed. Freedom was precious. Choice was sacred. But he now believed the world had proven itself incapable of using those gifts wisely. Too much weakness, too much division, too much delay, too much pride. The age of uncertain rulers had failed. The world needed order. Only after perfect peace, he believed, could true freedom flourish again. Temporary control, permanent peace. That was the promise. Every tyrant believes their rule is temporary. Aragorn understood then that Gandalf he loved still lived, but buried beneath certainty too immense to challenge. He rose without another word, and from that moment, even the faithful knew the war against Sauron had become something greater, a war to decide the future nature of Middle-earth itself. Then came the march, east toward Mordor, toward the Black Gate, toward destiny. As the host advanced, Gandalf's power grew. The ring no longer merely influenced him, it answered him. Fire bent around his will, light gathered where he walked, storms shifted at his command. His staff shone like a spear of living dawn. Those who marched behind him felt almost invincible. Fatigue lessened, fear weakened, doubt vanished. Courage surged unnaturally high. Meria had once inspired hearts through subtle fire. Now, the One Ring magnified that principle into overwhelming force. Hope itself became weaponized. The army no longer fought as individuals. It moved as one body, one purpose, one will. On the borders of Mordor, Sauron finally beheld his rival fully, and for the first time since the downfall of Numenor, the Dark Lord knew terror. Not because Gandalf matched him, because Gandalf was becoming greater. Sauron understood domination. He understood tyranny, but Gandalf brought something more dangerous: legitimacy. The free peoples loved him, trusted him, followed willingly. Sauron ruled through fear. Gandalf ruled through devotion. Devotion creates stronger chains than fear. The first great battle shattered the plains before Mordor. Light met shadow. Fire met fire. The white host struck with impossible force. Orcs broke. Trolls fell. Siege towers burned. The Nazgul descended shrieking from black skies, and Gandalf raised his hand. White flame erupted upward. The air screamed. The fell beasts ignited mid-flight. One by one, the Nazgul were cast down. The armies of men cried out in ecstasy. Victory seemed inevitable. And yet, amidst triumph, something subtle was dying. Not bodies, not kingdoms, something harder to see. The independence of hearts, the old courage of choosing hope despite fear. For now, hope required no choice. Gandalf supplied it, abundantly, overwhelmingly. He carried everyone forward, and slowly, Middle-earth forgot how to stand without him. That was the true cost, not defeat. Dependence. The ring had not made Gandalf cool. It had made him indispensable. And once a world believes it cannot survive without one ruler, freedom is already fading. Still the war advanced. Still Barad-dûr loomed. And within the Dark Tower, Sauron prepared for the final confrontation. For at last, two powers of the same order would meet. Maya against Maya. Ring Lord against Dark Lord. And the fate of the world would be decided in fire. At last, the armies of the West stood before Barad-dûr. There rose the Dark Tower, vast, black, terrible. Its foundations sank deep into poisoned earth, bound by the power of the ring itself, and strengthened through centuries of cruelty and will. Around it, the plains of Gorgoroth burned. Ash fell like gray snow. The air shimmered with heat. Mount Doom roared in the distance, its fires answering the power now gathered before Mordor. For upon that black land stood two beings greater than kings, two ancient spirits, two Maiar, two wills seeking dominion over Middle-earth, Sauron and Gandalf. The armies behind Gandalf waited in silence. No battle cry rose, no horn sounded. Even hardened warriors felt the weight of the moment. They understood, however dimly, that the fate of the world no longer rested in swords or siege engines. It rested in power older than kingdoms. Then the gates of Barad-dûr opened. Darkness poured outward. Not merely shadow, but presence. The pressure of vast malice. And from within came Sauron. No fair form remained. No deception. No beauty. Only power stripped bare. He stood immense, clad in black iron and flame, crowned in fire. His gaze terrible, beyond mortal endurance. Many fell to their knees, merely beholding him. Yet before him stood Gandalf. White fire surrounded him. His staff burned like a pillar of dawn. The ring blazed upon his hand. Its golden band had become nearly impossible to behold. Too bright, too pure, too absolute. Sauron spoke first, not with voice alone. His words struck mind and spirit alike. He named Gandalf a fool, a hypocrite. He declared that all dominion leads to the same end, that power cannot remain gentle, that rule always demands submission. In this, Sauron spoke a terrible truth, for even lies often wear fragments of truth. Gandalf answered, calmly. He declared that Sauron had corrupted power through cruelty. He himself would wield it through wisdom, through justice, through order. He would heal what Sauron had ruined. He would bring peace. and Sauron laughed. Sound like iron breaking, for he alone fully understood. Gandalf had already crossed the threshold. He simply did not know it. Then they fought. No song among elves or men could fully describe what followed. Light and shadow collided. Fire screamed through ash-filled air. Stone cracked. The plains trembled. Waves of force shattered towers and tore trenches into black earth. Sauron struck with hatred sharpened by ages. Gandalf answered with will brighter than flame. Black fire met white fire. Terror met certainty. Dominion met dominion. Again and again they clashed. The sky darkened. Lightning split the heavens. Mount Doom answered with thunder. Armies fled merely to survive a storm of power around them. At first, Sauron matched him, for though diminished from ancient ages, the Dark Lord remained mighty. But slowly, inevitably, the balance shifted. The ring betrayed its maker. It strengthened Gandalf, fed him, empowered him. Sauron felt it. His advantage slipping, his own power answering another will. Fear became desperation. Desperation became fury. But fury clouded judgment. And Gandalf did not falter, for he no longer doubted. No hesitation remained. No mercy restrained his strength. Only purpose. Only victory. At last, Gandalf raised his hand. The ring blazed like a star fallen to earth. White fire erupted. Not warm, not comforting. Absolute, purifying, judging, overwhelming. Sauron screamed. For the first time in long ages, the Dark Lord knew defeat. His armored form cracked. Flame burst through black iron. Shadow tore apart under unbearable radiance. And then Sauron fell. His body failed. His form collapsed. His spirit broke from visible shape, scattered, dispersed, driven into powerless exile. The Dark Lord was defeated, truly defeated. Barad-dûr trembled. Its foundations failed. The great tower collapsed into ruin. Stone shattered. Iron fell. Fire consumed all. The armies of Mordor broke. Orcs fled in madness. The Nazgûl vanished. Darkness collapsed. Victory had come. Complete. Total. Impossible. The free peoples cried out in triumph. Men wept. Elves stood stunned. Dwarves raised axes in exultation. The impossible had happened. Sauron was gone. Middle-earth was saved. Yet, amid the joy, silence touched the wise. Elrond did not rejoice. Galadriel did not smile. Aragorn felt only grief. For they alone truly understood Sauron had fallen. But the ring remained, and Gandalf still wore it. Then Gandalf turned, slowly, toward the armies of the west. White fire still burned around him, but now something had changed. Victory had removed the final restraint. There was no rival left, no enemy great enough to justify limitation. Only one power remained supreme, his. When he spoke, all listened, not by choice, by nature. His voice filled plain and mind alike. He declared the darkness ended, war ended, division ended. The age of uncertainty was over. A new age had begun. An age of peace, of justice, of order. Many cheered. Most cheered. Why would they not? Their Savior had delivered them. Among the wise, dread settled like winter frost, for they heard what others missed, not hope, finality. The language of absolute rule. There would be no more kings, no independent realms, no divided peoples, no freedom to choose wrongly. Only harmony, enforced by perfect wisdom, perfect power. And thus, upon the ashes of Barad-dûr, Gandalf won. He had defeated Sauron. He had saved Middle-earth. And in doing so, he had become its unquestioned Lord. Thus began an age unlike any that had come before. The great wars ceased. The Black Gate lay in ruins. No banners of Mordor rose again. No orc hosts marched from the mountains. The Nazgûl were no more. For the first time since the Elder Days, no dark power threatened the peoples of Middle-earth. Peace had come, and because peace had come, few questioned its price. The kingdoms of men remained, their banners still flew, their kings still sat upon ancient thrones. Yet all authority now flowed from one source. No law was made without Gandalf's blessing, no alliance forged without his counsel, no army raised without his command. The rulers of Middle-earth still wore crowns, but they no longer ruled. They governed. There is a difference. Aragorn accepted this burden with sorrow. He had become king of the reunited kingdom, just as destiny had foretold. Yet, even he understood that his crown had become symbolic. When difficult decisions arose, every eye turned westward, toward the White Lord, toward Mithrandir, toward the one whose wisdom had never failed. At first, this seemed no hardship. Gandalf judged wisely. Taxes were fair. Justice was swift. The weak were protected. The hungry were fed. Roads became safe. Trade flourished once more. The forests were guarded. The great seas were rebuilt. Minas Tirith shone brighter than ever before. Osgiliath rose again from its long ruin. The scars of war slowly disappeared beneath careful hands. The people rejoiced. They sang of Gandalf not merely as a hero, but as the greatest ruler Middle-earth had ever known. Children grew to adulthood knowing only peace. They spoke of Sauron as one speaks of an old nightmare. Impossible. Defeated forever. And indeed, no shadow dared rise. For who could challenge the bearer of the One Ring? Yet peace possesses its own temptations. Slowly, almost too slowly to perceive, something precious began to fade. Not joy, not prosperity, freedom. Disagreements became rare, not because all hearts agreed, because opposing Gandalf felt increasingly unthinkable. He was always right. History proved it. His judgments never failed. His foresight surpassed every king and every lore master. If Gandalf advised one course, who possessed the wisdom to argue otherwise? And so fewer voices spoke, not from fear, from certainty. The wise, who had once challenged one another, now sought only confirmation. Councils became formalities. Debate became memory. Questions became unnecessary. Even Aragorn, wisest among the kings of men, found himself hesitating before disagreeing, not because he lacked courage, because doubt seemed foolish beside perfect wisdom. The ring had accomplished its final work. It had not enslaved through terror. It had made obedience appear reasonable. Deladriel watched these changes from Lothlorien. Her realm still endured, sustained now by Gandalf's immeasurable strength. Yet she perceived what others could not. The songs of the elves had changed. They remained beautiful, but something of their freedom had vanished. The old songs wandered, the new songs praised. Even beauty had become orderly. Elrond departed across the sea without celebration. He had no words left. The age he had hoped to preserve had ended, not in fire, not in ruin, but beneath perfect order. One by one, the Eldar sailed into the west, not because darkness had conquered Middle-earth, because it no longer belonged to them. It belonged to one will, one purpose, one unchallenged vision of the good. Only the hobbits remained strangely untouched, perhaps because they asked for so little, perhaps because simple hearts preserve freedoms that great kingdoms forget, or perhaps because Gandalf still remembered them as they had once been. Yet even the Shire slowly changed. Roads widened, rules multiplied. Every change made sense. Every improvement solved a problem. Every law promised greater happiness, and each was accepted gladly, for who would refuse the wisdom of the Savior of the world? Thus, the years passed, gentle, orderly, peaceful, and Middle-earth became the fairest realm it had ever known. It also became the quietest, for no voice any longer dared ask whether another path might exist. No child grew believing they might shape the world differently. The future had already been decided, perfectly, forever. And Gandalf, looking upon this age of peace, believed with all sincerity that he had fulfilled the purpose for which he had first crossed the sea. He never believed himself fallen. He believed himself victorious. The years passed into decades, the decades into centuries. No armies marched from Mordor, no dragons darkened the sky, no kingdoms fell. Peace endured. The roads were safe, harvests were plentiful. Children grew to adulthood, never knowing war. To many, it seemed that Gandalf had accomplished the impossible. He had given Middle-earth an age without fear. Yet something unseen had quietly disappeared. The old songs were sung less often. Not because they were forbidden, but because they were no longer needed. Who needed courage when every danger had already been defeated? Who needed hope when one perfect ruler watched over all? The people slowly forgot how to choose. Every difficult decision already had an answer. Every conflict already had a wiser judge. Freedom faded, not beneath fear, but beneath certainty. Gandalf loved Middle-earth with all his heart. that had never changed. He wished no kingdom to suffer, no child to fear, no shadow ever to return. And because he loved the world so completely, he could no longer leave any part of it to chance. Everything had to be guided. Everything had to be protected. Everything had to be made right. One evening, Gandalf stood alone beside the western sea. The gulls wheeled overhead. Beyond the horizon lay Amen, the home he had left long ago. He remembered another life, a wandering pilgrim, a friend to hobbits, a counselor to kings, a wizard who inspired others to act rather than ruling in their place. He looked upon the ring. It still shone with flawless light. Then, for the first time in many long years, a single question entered his heart. Had he truly saved Middle-earth, or merely made it obedient? The thought lingered only for a moment. The ring answered with quiet certainty. You have given them peace. What greater gift could there be? Gandalf looked upon the kingdoms he had preserved. They were prosperous, beautiful, orderly. Everything he had fought to protect still lived. Everything except the freedom that had once made those lives worth defending. He had defeated Sauron, but he had inherited his place, not as a lord of darkness, but as a lord of perfect order. Thus ended the War of the Ring. The shadow was gone. The world endured. Yet Tolkien's oldest truth remained. Evil does not always come clad in darkness. Sometimes it comes clothed in light, speaking with kindness, promising peace, and asking only one thing in return, that every free heart surrender the burden of choosing. The end.